That project is so unrealistic that even the National Aeronautics and Space Administration would laugh at it. The words landed in the classroom like a dropped metal tray. A few students chuckled. Others glanced around, unsure whether they were supposed to laugh or stay quiet. Mr. Richard Collins stood at the front of the room with one hand resting on the edge of a long lab table, the fluorescent lights above casting a pale glow across rows of science projects built from cardboard, wires, and plastic tubing. In his other hand, he held a thin folder with the name Ava Johnson written neatly across the top in blue ink. Ava sat in the last row near the tall windows, her hands folded quietly in her lap. Outside the glass, late autumn wind moved through the oak trees that lined the football field behind Lincoln Ridge High School. The leaves scraped softly across the pavement, a faint whisper that almost sounded like someone warning the room to slow down. But inside the classroom, the energy moved in the opposite direction. Mr. Collins flipped open the folder and glanced down at the printed diagrams. He raised one eyebrow, then looked back at the students. A self-powered water purification system built from recycled household materials, he read aloud. His voice carried the kind of careful politeness teachers sometimes used right before they dismissed something entirely. A few students leaned forward. Others were already whispering to each other. On the demonstration table in front of him sat Ava's project. It looked different from the polished displays around it. The base was a wooden board cut from an old cabinet panel. Thin copper pipes curved between two clear containers. One held cloudy gray water. The other sat empty, waiting. A small solar panel the size of a notebook rested beside a quiet pump, made from repurposed plumbing parts. Mr. Collins tapped the board lightly with his knuckle. And according to this, he continued, lifting the paper again, this device can remove nearly all contaminants from untreated water using only sunlight and low-energy filtration. He let the words hang in the air for a moment. Then he smiled in a way that made several students laugh before he even spoke again. Ava, he said, looking toward the back row, that is a very creative imagination. More laughter spread across the room. Ava did not move. She did not lower her eyes either. She simply watched the front of the room with the same calm expression she always wore, the one that made people assume she was shy or unsure. In truth, her mind was replaying every test she had run in the small garage behind the apartment she shared with her mother. Every measurement, every late-night adjustment, every drop of water that had slowly turned from murky gray to crystal clear inside those two containers. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Now back inside that classroom, the laughter slowly faded, but the tension remained. Mr. Collins closed the folder and placed it beside the model. Scientific ideas need proof, he said, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. A student in the front row raised his phone as if to take a picture of the strange-looking device. Someone else whispered that it looked like a middle school plumbing experiment. Ava finally stood. The chair legs scraped softly across the tile floor as she stepped forward. The entire room watched her walk toward the front table. She was quiet, just as she always was. Quiet in class discussions. Quiet in the hallways. Quiet during group work where louder students usually took control. Mr. Collins folded his arms. "Would you like to demonstrate your theory?" he asked, clearly expecting the attempt to fail. Ava reached the table and placed one hand gently on the wooden base of the device. Her voice was soft, but steady enough that every person in the room could hear it. "It is not a theory," she said. "It is a working system." The room grew still. Somewhere in the back, a chair creaked. Ava turned the small valve that connected the cloudy water container to the copper pipe. Sunlight from the tall classroom windows touched the solar panel, and the pump began to hum quietly. Drop by drop, the gray water started moving through the clear tubing. No one laughed now. Even Mr. Collins leaned forward slightly as the first filter drops began forming inside the empty container. Ava watched the water collect, her expression unchanged. What no one in that classroom knew, yet, was that somewhere far beyond Lincoln Ridge High School, inside a research office hundreds of miles away, A scientist working late at a computer screen was about to open a file that carried the exact same name written across the top in blue ink. Ava Johnson. The first drop of clear water fell into the empty container with a soft sound that echoed through the classroom like a quiet challenge. No one laughed this time. The students leaned forward in their chairs as the small pump continued to hum, pushing cloudy gray water through the narrow copper pipes. Inside the clear tubing, the murky liquid slowly changed, moving through layers of charcoal and filtration material that Ava had packed by hand in her garage at home. Mr. Richard Collins watched closely now, the confident smile fading from his face as another drop formed. Then another, each one landing in the container below like proof that refused to stay hidden. A student near the front whispered that it actually looked clean. Another student stood halfway out of his chair, tried to see better. Ava kept her eyes on the device, not on the room, her hands resting lightly on the wooden board to steady it. The filtered water continued collecting at the bottom of the container, clear enough that the fluorescent lights above the table reflected sharply across its surface. Mr. Collins cleared his throat and stepped closer to the project. He crouched slightly, bringing his face near the tubing as if expecting to find some trick hidden inside the pipes. Interesting, he said slowly, the words stretched thin with skepticism. But a visual demonstration does not prove full purification. His voice was firm again, as if he were reminding the class that he still controlled the room. Ava nodded once, calm and respectful. "You can test it," she said quietly. "The data is in the folder." Mr. Collins glanced toward the papers he had set aside earlier. For a moment, he did not reach for them. Instead, he straightened and looked around the room at the students watching him. The atmosphere had shifted. The laughter from earlier felt distant now, replaced by a low silence filled with curiosity. Finally, he picked up the folder and flipped through the printed charts. Each page contained measurements written neatly in blue ink. Turbidity levels, filtration rates, energy input from the solar panel. The numbers were small but consistent, recorded across weeks of testing. Mr. Collins frowned slightly as he studied the pages. "Where exactly did you conduct these tests?" he asked. Ava answered without hesitation. "In my garage." A few students exchanged glances. The idea that a high school student had run repeated water filtration experiments in a small residential garage sounded improbable to them. Mr. Collins seemed to think the same. "And you expect us to believe these measurements were recorded with laboratory precision?" he asked. Ava did not argue. She simply reached into her backpack and removed a small digital testing meter. "You can test the water yourself," she said. The device looked worn but functional, the kind used by plumbers and environmental technicians. Mr. Collins hesitated before taking it. He dipped the probe into the container of newly filtered water. The display lit up. He watched the numbers settle. A long second passed. Then another. The reading remained steady. One student whispered a quiet wow under his breath. Mr. Collins quickly removed the probe and set the meter back on the table. His expression hardened slightly, as if the result had created more questions than answers. "Even if the filtration is effective," he said, "scaling this system for real-world use would be extremely difficult." Ava nodded again. "That is why the design uses recycled materials and low-power input," she replied. "It can be built anywhere sunlight is available." The room fell silent once more. Outside the classroom window, the afternoon sun slipped lower over the football field, sending a narrow beam of light across the table where the clear water continued to gather drop by drop. For the first time since the demonstration began, several students looked at Ava not as the quiet girl who sat in the back of the room, but as someone who might understand something they did not. Mr. Collins closed the folder with a sharp motion. "Science requires peer verification," he said firmly. "Until independent experts confirm these results, we must remain cautious." He stepped away from the table and turned toward the class. "The demonstration period is over." Chairs scraped softly as students shifted, still glancing toward the device that continued to hum quietly under the sunlight. Ava turned off the pump and carefully capped the container of clear water. As she packed the components back into her bag, she could feel the room watching her in a different way now. not with laughter, but with uncertainty. What no one in that classroom realized was that the quiet project sitting inside Ava Johnson's backpack had already begun traveling far beyond Lincoln Ridge High School. Late that same evening, in a research office filled with computer monitors and technical diagrams, a scientist reviewing environmental filtration models would pause when a small file uploaded to a public science forum appeared on his screen. The file carried a simple title written in blue text: Shoulder-Powered Water Purification Prototype by Ava Johnson. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil and damp concrete when Ava Johnson pushed the side door open later that evening. The small bulb above the workbench flickered once before filling the space with a warm yellow glow. Her backpack slid from her shoulder onto the wooden table beside the filtration prototype. For a moment, she simply stood there listening to the quiet hum of the old refrigerator in the corner and the distant sound of traffic passing along the highway 2 blocks away. Lincoln Ridge High School was miles behind her now, but the echo of laughter from the classroom still lingered somewhere in her mind. Ava reached down and gently lifted the clear container from her project. The water inside caught the light from the bulb and reflected it back across the garage walls. She had seen that reflection hundreds of times during testing, yet it still gave her the same quiet sense of relief. Proof mattered, not opinions, not assumptions, just proof. She set the container down and opened the notebook that lay beside the workbench. The pages were filled with rows of careful handwriting. Filtration times, energy measurements, turbidity readings. Each line represented another late evening like this one. Outside the garage, the sky had already turned dark blue as autumn settled across the small neighborhood. Ava's mother would not be home for another hour. The night shift at the hospital meant long hours cleaning hallways that most people never noticed. Ava turned the page and added a new entry to the log. Demonstration completed at Lincoln Ridge High School Science Fair. System performance stable. Solar input sufficient through classroom window. She paused for a moment, then added one more note beneath it. Teacher requested independent verification. The pen rested between her fingers as she thought about that sentence. Mr. Richard Collins had not exactly asked for verification. His tone had made it sound more like a challenge. Ava closed the notebook and looked back at the prototype. The device was not perfect. The pump could still stall if sunlight dropped too low. The charcoal filter needed replacement after extended use. But the core design worked. Water moved through the copper system slowly and steadily, purified by materials that could be found almost anywhere. She turned on the pump again, letting the system run while she checked the connections. The soft vibration filled the quiet garage. Drop by drop, the process continued, exactly as it had in the classroom earlier that day. What Ava did not know was that far from the quiet street where she lived, the digital copy of her project notes had begun its own journey. Late evening had settled over a research facility in California where the windows reflected the orange glow of city lights. Inside one office, a man named Dr. Ethan Walker leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes after hours spent reviewing environmental engineering proposals. His computer screen displayed a long list of research submissions collected from public science forums used by universities and independent researchers. Most of the files looked familiar. Graduate-level filtration studies, industrial-scale desalination concepts. Walker was about to close the final document when a smaller entry caught his attention. Shoulder-Powered Water Purification Prototype. Author Ava Johnson. Lincoln Ridge High School. Walker hesitated. High school submissions rarely appeared in the research database. Curious, he opened the file. The first page showed a simple diagram drawn with careful precision. Copper tubing, recycled filtration layers, solar-driven pump input. Walker leaned closer to the screen. The structure looked basic at first glance, but the efficiency calculations attached to the diagram were unexpectedly detailed. He scrolled through the document slowly. Data tables filled several pages, each measurement carefully recorded across repeated tests. Walker reached for his notebook and began copying a few of the numbers. After a moment, he ran a quick simulation using the engineering software on his computer. The model processed the filtration variables and produced a result that made him sit up straight. He ran the simulation again. The numbers stayed consistent. Walker stared at the screen for several seconds before speaking quietly to himself. That efficiency should not be possible with materials this simple. Back in the quiet garage miles away, Ava shut off the pump and began wiping condensation from the copper tubing. The system had performed exactly as expected. Outside the window, the street light flickered on, casting a pale glow across the driveway. Ava packed the prototype carefully into its storage case and closed the lid. Tomorrow, the science fair judges would review the projects again before announcing their decisions. She did not know whether they would believe the results. But somewhere in a research office far from Lincoln Ridge, a scientist had just finished reading her work for the third time, and the curiosity on his face was beginning to turn into something else entirely. The next morning at Lincoln Ridge High School began with the familiar rhythm of lockers closing and footsteps echoing through long hallways lined with faded banners from past football championships. Ava Johnson walked through the entrance quietly, her backpack resting against her shoulder, the careful weight of her project notes and data files inside it. The sky outside was pale gray, and a cool autumn wind slipped through the open doors as students gathered before the first bell. Ava moved through the crowd the same way she always did, unnoticed by most of the conversations swirling around her. But inside the science wing, something felt different. Several students who had watched the demonstration the day before were already talking about the filtration device. A few glanced toward Ava as she passed, their expressions no longer amused but curious. She reached her locker and placed her bag inside, leaving only her notebook in her hand. The hallway clock ticked steadily above the door as the warning bell sounded. Inside the classroom, Mr. Richard Collins stood beside the long lab table reviewing the science fair evaluation forms. The fluorescent lights above him hummed softly. On the display table, the projects from the previous day had been returned for final judging. Ava's filtration prototype sat exactly where she had left it. The copper tubing reflected the pale classroom light, and the small solar panel rested beside the pump like a quiet witness to everything that had happened. Mr. Collins glanced up as Ava entered the room. His expression was calm but guarded. Yesterday's demonstration had clearly unsettled the easy confidence he usually carried in front of his students. Still, he maintained the tone of authority expected from a senior science teacher. "Good morning," he said evenly. Ava nodded politely and took her usual seat near the back window. Outside, the football field was still empty, dew glistening across the grass. One by one, the rest of the class settled into their chairs. A few students whispered about the water test from the previous day. Others leaned toward the demonstration table as if the filtration device might reveal something new overnight. Mr. Collins cleared his throat and lifted a clipboard. "Today, the judging committee will review the projects again before the final science fair results are announced," he explained. "Each demonstration must include documentation and repeatable testing." His eyes moved briefly toward Ava's project before returning to the clipboard. "Scientific credibility depends on verification." Ava listened quietly. She had expected this. Proof never arrived all at once. It had to be repeated, measured, questioned again and again. That was how science worked. What she did not know was that hundreds of miles away, inside the research facility where Dr. Ethan Walker worked, the quiet curiosity from the previous night had grown into focused investigation. Walker sat at his desk with Ava's digital file open once more on his monitor. The office around him was filled with the low hum of equipment and the distant sound of other researchers beginning their morning work. He had spent hours reviewing the filtration design, comparing it with existing environmental engineering models used in remote research stations. The numbers continued to surprise him. The efficiency level described in Ava Johnson's testing notes suggested a system capable of producing clean drinking water using minimal energy input. Walker leaned forward and ran another simulation through the engineering software. The screen filled with graphs and projected filtration curves. Once again, the system produced results that matched Ava's handwritten measurements almost perfectly. Walker sat back slowly. Most high school science projects relied heavily on borrowed ideas from textbooks. This design was different. It combined simple materials with a structure that solved a problem engineers had been studying for years. He reached for his phone and called a colleague across the hall. "You need to see something," he said. A few minutes later, another researcher stood beside his desk, examining the diagrams on the screen. Both scientists studied the filtration model in silence. Finally, the colleague spoke. "Where did this come from?" Walker pointed to the author line on the document. "Ava Johnson, Lincoln Ridge High School." His colleague frowned slightly. "A high school student wrote this." Walker nodded slowly. "That is what the file says." Back inside the classroom at Lincoln Ridge High School, the judging committee entered through the side door, carrying evaluation folders and testing equipment. The room quieted immediately as they approached the demonstration tables. Ava folded her hands calmly on her desk while the judges moved toward the filtration device. Mr. Collins stepped aside to give them space. The lead judge lifted the clear container and examined the water inside. "We will repeat the test," she said. Ava stood and walked forward to activate the system once more. As sunlight from the tall windows touched the small solar panel, the pump began to hum again. Clear water slowly formed inside the container drop by drop. The judges watched closely, writing notes on their clipboards. Mr. Collins remained silent, observing the process with a thoughtful expression. For the first time since the project had appeared in his classroom, the possibility that he might have underestimated something was beginning to settle uncomfortably in his mind. And far away inside the research facility, Dr. Ethan Walker was opening a new message window on his computer, preparing to send a question that would soon travel across the country toward the quiet student who had built a water system powerful enough to capture the attention of scientists who had never heard her name before. The filtration system continued to run beneath the quiet sunlight, streaming through the tall classroom windows, and the room remained unusually silent as the judging committee leaned closer to observe the process. The copper tubes glowed softly in the light, while the small solar panel absorbed just enough energy to keep the pump humming steadily. Inside the clear container at the end of the system, drop after drop of purified water gathered with patient precision. The lead judge watched carefully, her eyes shifting between the tubing, the pump, and the digital testing meter resting on the table. Ava Johnson stood beside the device with calm focus, adjusting a valve slightly to stabilize the flow rate. Every movement she made was careful and familiar. The same routine she had practiced countless evenings inside the quiet garage behind her home. One of the judges stepped forward and lifted the testing meter that Ava had used the previous day. Without speaking, he placed the probe into the container of newly filtered water. The screen lit up softly. Numbers appeared and then slowly stabilized. The judge studied the display for several seconds before lowering the device again. He exchanged a glance with the lead judge, who wrote a short note on her evaluation sheet. Across the room, several students leaned forward in their chairs. The earlier laughter from the class had been replaced by quiet curiosity. Even Mr. Richard Collins stood near the wall watching the process with an expression that was far more thoughtful than confident. The filtration continued working exactly as Ava had described. Cloudy gray water entered the first chamber. The charcoal layer absorbed contaminants. The final chamber released clear water into the collection container. The entire process moved slowly but consistently, powered only by the sunlight reaching the panel through the classroom windows. After several minutes, the lead judge finally spoke. Her voice carried clearly across the room. "The system appears to perform as documented." Ava nodded respectfully, but said nothing. The judge turned slightly toward Mr. Collins. "Did the student provide full documentation for the testing procedure?" Mr. Collins hesitated for a brief moment before answering. "Yes, the records are in the folder." The judge opened the folder and examined the handwritten data tables. Page after page showed careful measurements recorded over weeks of repeated testing. Filtration time, turbidity reduction, solar energy input. The judge flipped through the pages slowly. "This level of documentation is unusual for a high school project," she said quietly. Mr. Collins gave a small nod, though the tone of his voice was noticeably more reserved than it had been the day before. The student claims the tests were conducted independently. Ava remained standing beside the table. The sunlight shifted slightly as clouds passed outside the classroom windows, but the pump continued running with steady rhythm. The lead judge returned the folder to the table and wrote several additional notes on her clipboard. "We will include this project in the final evaluation," she announced. The committee moved on to the next display, leaving Ava's filtration system still running quietly at the edge of the table. The classroom slowly returned to its normal atmosphere as students whispered to one another about what they had just seen. Ava shut off the pump and sealed the container of clean water, placing it carefully beside the prototype. For a moment, she looked out the window toward the empty football field where the late morning sunlight stretched across the grass. The demonstration had gone exactly as expected. Proof had spoken for itself. What Ava did not know was that at almost the same moment the judging committee finished their evaluation, Dr. Ethan Walker sat in front of his computer in California reviewing the filtration model once again. The engineering simulation he had run earlier that morning remained open on the screen, displaying efficiency curves that continued to match Ava Johnson's handwritten data. Walker leaned forward in his chair and typed a message into the research network communication system used by environmental engineering teams across the country. He attached the file containing Ava's design and added a short note to several colleagues. The message asked a simple question. Could a solar-powered filtration system built from recycled materials truly reach this level of efficiency? Within minutes, responses began appearing from researchers who had opened the file. Some expressed curiosity. Others requested additional data. Walker read each response carefully before opening a new message window addressed to the original author of the file. Ava Johnson, Lincoln Ridge High School. He paused for a moment, considering the unusual nature of the situation. Then he began typing a direct question that would soon travel across the country toward a quiet student whose science project had already begun reaching far beyond the walls of her classroom. The afternoon bell rang at Lincoln Ridge High School with its usual metallic echo, and the hallways quickly filled with the sound of students gathering their backpacks and moving toward the exits. Ava Johnson walked more slowly than most, carrying the protective case that held her filtration prototype. The science fair judging would not be finalized until the following day, but she preferred to keep the device with her rather than leave it unattended overnight. Outside the school, building the air had grown cooler, and the long shadows of the oak trees stretched across the parking lot. Ava paused near the sidewalk and looked briefly back toward the science wing windows before continuing down the quiet street that led toward her neighborhood. At home, the small garage behind the apartment building welcomed her with the familiar scent of metal tools and old wood shelves. She placed the prototype carefully on the workbench and began her usual routine. The pump was removed and cleaned. The copper tubing was checked for small blockages. The charcoal filter chamber was opened so the material inside could dry before the next test. These careful steps had become part of her evening rhythm. Outside the garage, the distant hum of traffic blended with the faint sound of a train horn from the rail line that crossed the edge of town. Ava wiped her hands on a cloth and reached for her laptop resting on the corner of the workbench. The screen glowed softly as it opened. She logged into the public science forum, where she had uploaded the design files the previous week. Usually the page showed very little activity. A few downloads, sometimes a brief comment from another student experimenting with similar ideas. Tonight, the notification icon displayed a number she had never seen before. Several new messages had appeared on the forum thread connected to her project. Ava leaned closer to the screen. The first comment came from a user profile associated with an environmental engineering research group in Arizona. The message asked whether the filtration efficiency could remain stable under reduced sunlight conditions. Another comment from a researcher in Oregon asked about the specific charcoal density used inside the filtration chamber. Ava scrolled through the questions slowly. Each one was thoughtful and technical. These were not the casual responses she expected from a high school forum. Someone had clearly shared the design with people who understood the science behind it. She opened the document containing her testing notes and began typing careful replies to each question. Her answers explained the structure of the copper pipe system, the solar input required to maintain steady pump operation, and the reason recycled materials had been selected for the design. Nearly an hour passed while she worked through the list. Then a new message notification appeared at the top of the screen. The sender address looked different from the others. The profile name read Ethan Walker Environmental Systems Division. Ava opened the message. The text was short but direct. Good evening, Ava Johnson. My name is Dr. Ethan Walker, and I work with a research team studying sustainable water systems for remote environments. Your filtration design appeared in a research thread shared earlier today. The efficiency measurements you documented are extremely interesting. Could you confirm whether your data was collected through repeated testing, and if so, how many cycles were completed during your trials? Ava read the message twice. She had never received a question like this before. The tone was professional and serious. It did not sound like the skeptical comments she sometimes saw on student forums. She opened her notebook and checked the final page of recorded tests. The filtration system had been run repeatedly across several weeks. She typed a careful reply explaining the number of tests completed, the average filtration time for each cycle, and the environmental conditions during those experiments. After reading the message one final time, she pressed send. The response disappeared into the network, and the screen returned to the forum page. Ava closed the laptop and leaned back slightly in her chair. Outside the garage, the sky had turned completely dark. The small streetlight near the driveway cast a pale circle of light across the pavement. She had no way of knowing that the person who had sent that message was now sitting inside a research office hundreds of miles away, reading her response with growing fascination. Dr. Ethan Walker studied the detailed explanation on his monitor and slowly nodded to himself. The data was not random. The student understood exactly how the system worked. Walker opened a new message window and began writing another question, this time requesting permission to review the complete design model. Back inside the quiet garage, Ava carefully sealed the filtration chamber and placed the prototype back inside its protective case. Tomorrow, the science fair judges would make their final decision. But somewhere far beyond Lincoln Ridge, high school, a conversation had already begun that could change the future of her small project in ways no one in that classroom had imagined. The following morning arrived quietly over Lincoln Ridge High School, and the pale sunlight of early autumn stretched across the parking lot as students filtered through the front entrance carrying backpacks and half-finished conversations. Ava Johnson stepped inside the building with the same calm pace she always used, though her mind felt more active than usual. The messages from the science forum the night before still lingered in her thoughts. She had answered every question carefully, including the one from Dr. Ethan Walker, but she had not expected another response so quickly. When she reached her locker, she placed her backpack inside and checked her laptop before the first bell. A new message had appeared. Ava opened it. Slowly. The sender was the same researcher who had contacted her the previous evening. Dr. Ethan Walker had written again. His message thanked her for the detailed explanation and requested permission to examine the complete engineering model used in her design. He explained that his team studied sustainable water systems for environments where resources were extremely limited, including remote research stations and experimental habitat structures. Ava read the message twice, her eyes moving carefully over each sentence. The tone remained respectful and curious. It did not sound like a prank or a joke. She typed a reply explaining that the full design files were already attached to the forum thread and that the prototype could be replicated using commonly available materials. Before closing the laptop, she added one more line. I would be happy to answer any additional questions about the system. After sending the message, she walked toward the science classroom, where the final science fair results would be discussed later that morning. Inside the room, the demonstration tables had been rearranged so the judges could review the projects one last time. Ava's filtration prototype rested on the table exactly where it had been placed the day before. The copper pipes reflected the bright classroom lights, while the clear container still held the final sample of purified water. Several students gathered nearby, examining the device more closely than before. One student asked quietly how the system kept the pump running without electricity from a wall outlet. Ava explained that the small solar panel stored just enough energy to power the pump during operation. Another student asked whether the charcoal filter needed replacement after each test. Ava answered patiently, describing how the filtration layers could be reused several times before efficiency began to decline. The conversations felt different from the laughter that had filled the room 2 days earlier. Even the students who had joked about the project now listened with genuine interest. At the front of the room, Mr. Richard Collins reviewed the final judging sheets with the science committee. His voice remained professional, though his tone had softened compared with the sharp skepticism he had shown during the first demonstration. When the bell rang, the room gradually quieted, and the lead judge stepped forward to address the class. She explained that several projects had performed well during evaluation and that the final decision would be announced before the end of the day. Ava returned to her seat by the window and looked out across the football field where a group of younger students were practicing for physical education class. The morning sunlight stretched across the grass while the distant sound of whistles drifted through the open window. For a moment, everything felt calm again. Yet far away in California, the conversation that had begun the night before was continuing to grow. Inside the research office where Dr. Ethan Walker worked, a small group of engineers now stood around his computer reviewing the filtration design together. Walker had shared Ava Johnson's data with 2 colleagues who specialized in environmental systems used for long-duration research missions. One engineer studied the energy calculations displayed on the screen, while another examined the structural diagram showing the layered filtration chambers. The discussion moved quickly as they compared the model with systems currently used in experimental habitats. Finally, one of the engineers leaned back in his chair and spoke quietly. If the measurements are accurate, this design could reduce energy consumption significantly in remote water recycling systems. Walker nodded slowly. That was exactly the conclusion he had reached the previous night. He opened Ava's latest message and read her response to the team. The clarity of her explanation made it clear that the student understood every detail of the system she had built. Walker considered the situation for a moment before opening a new email window on his computer. This time the message would not be sent through the public forum. Instead, it would travel directly from his research office to Lincoln Ridge High School. He began typing a formal message addressed to the school administration requesting confirmation of the student who had authored the filtration design. Back in the classroom, Ava sat quietly while the morning lessons began, completely unaware that an email was already traveling across the country that would soon arrive in the school office and begin a chain of events none of the students in that room were prepared to witness. The late morning sun climbed higher above Lincoln Ridge High School, casting long bands of light across the polished floor of the main hallway, while the quiet rhythm of classroom lectures carried on behind closed doors. Ava Johnson sat near the back window of the science room, listening as Mr. Richard Collins reviewed basic environmental engineering principles with the class. His voice moved steadily across the room, explaining concepts that Ava had already spent months exploring on her own while building the filtration system in her garage. The copper pipes and solar panel from her project remained on the demonstration table beside the whiteboard, waiting for the final science fair results to be announced later that afternoon. Several students continued glancing at the device during the lecture, their curiosity still lingering from the previous demonstrations. Outside the classroom, the school office had begun its usual daily routine. Phones rang occasionally, while administrative staff sorted paperwork and responded to parent messages. On the front desk computer, the email notification icon flashed quietly as a new message arrived from a sender whose address included the name of a research division connected to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The administrative assistant opened the message without much thought at first, assuming it might be a routine request for student outreach information. But as she read the first few lines, her posture slowly changed. The message was formal and direct. It requested confirmation that a student named Ava Johnson had submitted a water filtration research model connected to Lincoln Ridge High School. The sender explained that the design had appeared in a professional engineering research forum and had drawn the attention of several environmental system specialists. The assistant blinked in surprise and read the message again before standing from her chair. She carried the printed email across the office toward the principal's door. Principal Linda Brooks looked up from a stack of attendance reports as the assistant entered. The paper was placed gently on her desk. "You may want to read this," the assistant said quietly. Brooks adjusted her glasses and studied the message carefully. The letterhead clearly identified the sender as Dr. Ethan Walker from a research team associated with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration Environmental Systems Division. The message explained that Ava Johnson's filtration model appeared to demonstrate an unusually efficient water purification process using minimal solar energy input. Dr. Walker asked whether the school could confirm the authenticity of the student's work and whether additional documentation might be available for review. Principal Brooks leaned back slowly in her chair, absorbing the information. Lincoln Ridge High School had hosted many science fairs over the years, but it was rare for any project to attract outside professional attention. She stood and walked toward the classroom, Wing holding the printed email. Meanwhile, inside the science room, the lesson continued. Mr. Collins wrote several equations on the whiteboard while explaining the concept of filtration efficiency ratios. Ava listened quietly while taking notes in her notebook. The sunlight through the window moved gradually across her desk as the minutes passed. Suddenly, the classroom door opened. Principal Brooks stepped inside, carrying the printed message. Mr. Collins paused in the middle of his explanation and turned toward her. The room fell silent as the students watched the unexpected interruption. Brooks spoke calmly but with clear curiosity in her voice. "Excuse me for interrupting the lesson," she said. "I need to speak with Ava Johnson for a moment." Ava looked up in surprise as the entire class turned toward her. She stood slowly and walked to the front of the room. Mr. Collins glanced between the principal and the student, uncertain about the reason for the interruption. Brooks handed Ava the printed email. "This arrived in the school office a few minutes ago," she explained. Ava looked down at the page. Her eyes moved carefully across the message. The name Dr. Ethan Walker appeared near the bottom along with the full title of the research division connected to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. A quiet murmur spread across the classroom as several students leaned forward, trying to understand what was happening. Ava finished reading and looked up at the principal. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Brooks turned slightly toward the class and addressed Mr. Collins. "It seems that Ava's science project has attracted the attention of a research team connected to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration," she said. The words hung in the air like a sudden shift in gravity. The same room that had once echoed with laughter now sat completely silent as every student slowly turned their attention toward the filtration device resting on the demonstration table. Mr. Collins stared at the email still in Ava's hands, his earlier confidence dissolving in a quiet disbelief while the realization settled over the classroom that the quiet student they had underestimated might have built something far more important than anyone had imagined. For several long seconds, the classroom remained completely silent after Principal Linda Brooks finished speaking. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly while every student stared at Ava Johnson and the sheet of paper still resting in her hands. The name of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration seemed to hang in the air like something unreal. A few students exchanged confused glances. Others looked slowly toward the filtration device sitting quietly on the demonstration table. Mr. Richard Collins stood beside the whiteboard without speaking. His hand still held the marker he had been using moments earlier to write equations, but now the marker hung motionless at his side. Principal Brooks stepped closer to Ava and spoke gently. "Dr. Ethan Walker from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration Environmental Systems Division says your design appeared in a professional research forum. He wants to confirm that you are the author of the filtration model." Ava nodded calmly. "Yes, ma'am. I uploaded the design files last week." The principal studied her face for a moment, clearly impressed by the calm way the student responded to such unexpected attention. "And the system works exactly as described in the document?" she asked. Ava turned slightly and looked toward the demonstration table. The copper pipes reflected the bright classroom light, while the small solar panel rested beside the pump. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly. "I tested it many times. The The silence in the room deepened. Several students who had laughed during the first presentation now stared at the device with new understanding. One student in the front row whispered under his breath that the project might actually be real science. Another leaned forward to get a better look at the filtration chamber. Principal Brooks turned toward Mr. Collins. "Richard, have you reviewed Ava's full documentation?" Mr. Collins cleared his throat and adjusted his posture. "Yes," he said slowly. The student provided extensive testing records. His voice no longer carried the easy skepticism he had used during the first demonstration. Brooks nodded thoughtfully before addressing the class. "Dr. Walker has asked whether Ava would be willing to discuss her design with his research team. They believe the system could have applications in remote water recycling environments." A low murmur spread across the classroom. The words remote water recycling environments sounded far more serious than anything usually associated with a high school science fair. Ava remained quiet, her eyes still resting on the printed email. For her, the moment felt strangely calm rather than exciting. The filtration system had always been about solving a real problem. Access to clean water mattered. The fact that scientists had noticed the design simply meant the problem was worth solving. Mr. Collins finally stepped forward and looked at the message himself. The letterhead from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was clear and unmistakable. The message contained a professional signature from Dr. Ethan Walker, along with the contact information for the Environmental Systems Research Team. Collins read the email twice before lowering the paper slowly. The memory of his earlier laughter in front of the class now felt painfully sharp. He looked across the room toward the demonstration table and then toward Ava. For the first time since the science fair had begun, he seemed unsure what to say. Principal Brooks spoke again. "Ava, I would like you to come to the office after class so we can respond to Dr. Walker's message properly. This kind of opportunity deserves careful attention." Ava nodded respectfully. "Yes, ma'am." Brooks gave the class one final glance before leaving the room. The door closed softly behind her. The classroom remained quiet for a moment longer. Then Mr. Collins slowly walked toward the filtration prototype. He studied the copper pipes, the charcoal chamber, and the small solar panel that powered the pump. The device looked simple, almost ordinary. Yet the email from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration suggested that something about the design was far more important than he had first believed. He turned toward Ava with a thoughtful expression that carried a trace of regret. "Ava," he said carefully, "how long did you spend building this system?" Ava answered simply, "Several months." Collins nodded slowly. "And all of the testing was done in your garage?" "Yes, sir." Another long silence followed. The rest of the class watched the exchange closely. The teacher who had once dismissed the project now seemed to be seeing it for the first time. Collins looked back at the device and then toward the students. "Science," he said quietly, "sometimes appears in places we least expect." The room remained still as the significance of that statement settled over everyone present. What had begun as a simple classroom science fair project had now reached far beyond Lincoln Ridge High School. And somewhere inside a research facility connected to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, a team of engineers was waiting for a reply from a quiet student whose idea had just begun to change the way professionals looked at a problem they had been studying for years. The final bell for the morning period had barely finished echoing through the hallways when Ava Johnson walked beside Principal Linda Brooks toward the school office. Students glanced curiously as they passed, whispers spreading quietly through the corridor about the email that had arrived from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Ava moved calmly, holding the printed message in both hands while the soft sound of footsteps followed them across the polished tile floor. Inside the office, the atmosphere felt quieter than the busy hallway outside. Sunlight from the tall front windows stretched across the reception desk, where the administrative assistant sat watching with clear curiosity. Principal Brooks opened the door to her office and motioned for Ava to sit across from the desk. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper folders stacked neatly along the shelves behind her chair. Brooks sat down and adjusted her glasses before reading the message from Dr. Ethan Walker once more. The words remained just as surprising as when she had first seen them earlier that morning. After a moment, she looked up at Ava. Dr. Walker would like to speak with you directly about the filtration system you designed, she explained. He believes your model may have practical applications in environments where water recycling must operate with very limited energy. Ava nodded slowly. The explanation sounded serious, but not frightening. For her, the system had always been about solving a simple problem. Clean water should not require expensive equipment or large power supplies. Brooks turned her computer screen slightly so Ava could see the reply message she had begun typing. The response confirmed that Ava Johnson was indeed the student responsible for the project and that the design documentation had been reviewed by the science department at Lincoln Ridge High School. I would like to send the reply with your permission, Brooks said gently. Ava read the message carefully and nodded. Yes, ma'am. Brooks clicked the send button and leaned back in her chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the office window, the distant sound of students changing classes drifted faintly through the building. Several minutes passed before the computer notification sound chimed softly. A new email had arrived. Brooks opened the message and read quickly. Dr. Walker had responded almost immediately. He thanked the school for confirming the project and asked whether Ava would be available for a short video call later that afternoon so his research team could discuss the filtration design directly with her. Brooks looked at Ava with a mixture of surprise and admiration. It appears they are very interested in your work, she said. Ava remained calm, though a small spark of excitement appeared in her eyes. I can speak with them after school, she said quietly. Brooks smiled and typed a quick confirmation. Meanwhile, across the building inside the science classroom, Mr. Richard Collins stood beside the demonstration table, studying the filtration device once again. The copper pipes curved neatly between the chambers while the small solar panel rested beside the pump exactly where Ava had placed it. Several students gathered nearby, examining the system more closely than they had before. One student asked whether the charcoal filter could be replaced with other materials. Another wondered how long the pump could operate under cloudy conditions. Collins listened to the discussion without interrupting. The laughter that had once filled the room during the first demonstration now seemed distant and uncomfortable in his memory. He walked slowly around the table, examining the design with careful attention. The simplicity of the structure made the concept even more impressive. By the time the afternoon classes ended, the news had spread quietly through much of the school. Students whispered about the email from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, while teachers exchanged curious glances in the hallway. When the final bell rang, Ava returned to the office where Principal Brooks had arranged a video call. The computer screen glowed softly as the connection request appeared. Brooks nodded for Ava to sit in front of camera. The screen flickered and then displayed a small conference room filled with several engineers gathered around a table. At the center sat Dr. Ethan Walker. He smiled politely when he saw Ava on the screen. Good afternoon, Ava Johnson, he said warmly. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Your filtration design has raised several interesting questions among our research team. Ava returned the greeting calmly. Behind her, Principal Brooks watched quietly while the conversation began. Dr. Walker leaned forward slightly and asked the first question about the solar input requirements for the system. Ava answered clearly, describing the test cycle she had conducted in her garage and the adjustments she had made to stabilize the pump during lower light conditions. The engineers listened carefully, occasionally exchanging impressed glances as the student explained the details of the design with confident understanding. For several minutes, the discussion continued as Ava described the reasoning behind the recycled materials and the layered filtration structure. When the conversation paused, Dr. Walker folded his hands thoughtfully. Ava, he said, the simplicity and efficiency of your system is remarkable. Our team believes your design may help solve several problems we face in remote water recycling environments. The words hung in the air like a quiet turning point. In the science classroom earlier that week, the project had been treated like a curious experiment. Now the same design was being studied by engineers who worked on some of the most advanced environmental systems in the country. The video call continued quietly inside the office at Lincoln Ridge High School, while the late afternoon sunlight shifted across the desk behind Ava Johnson. On the screen, Dr. Ethan Walker and the group of engineers from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration listened with focused attention as Ava finished explaining the final stage of the filtration cycle. Her voice remained calm and clear as she described how the charcoal chamber captured contaminants before the final purification layer allowed clean water to collect in the container. The engineers exchanged thoughtful looks with one another while Dr. Walker nodded slowly. "Your explanation confirms what our initial simulation suggested," he said. "Your system produces unusually efficient purification with very little energy input." Ava sat quietly, her hands resting on the edge of the desk. For her, the explanation felt simple. The design had grown step by step through weeks of trial and adjustment in the small garage behind her home. Dr. Walker leaned slightly closer to the camera. "Ava," he continued, "our research team studies sustainable life support systems for environments where resources must be carefully conserved. That includes research stations in extremely remote locations and experimental habitats designed for future exploration missions." Ava listened carefully. The words future exploration missions carried a quiet weight. Walker continued speaking. "Water recycling is one of the most important challenges in those environments. Your filtration design solves several problems at once by reducing both energy consumption and material cost." The engineers beside him nodded in agreement. One of them spoke. Next, asking Ava how easily the charcoal filtration layer could be replaced if the system were used for long periods of time. Ava answered thoughtfully, explaining that the charcoal chamber had been designed so that the material could be removed and replaced without disassembling the entire device. Another engineer asked whether the system could operate under lower sunlight conditions. Ava described the small modifications she had made to the pump cycle to maintain steady operation even when sunlight was partially reduced. The conversation continued for several minutes while Ava answered each question with careful clarity. Finally, Dr. Walker folded his hands and smiled warmly. "Ava, we would like to invite you to share your full design documentation with our Environmental Systems Research Group. Our team believes your concept may contribute to future water recycling solutions for remote missions." The words filled the quiet office with a sense of possibility. Principal Linda Brooks stood beside the desk, listening with clear pride in her expression. Ava nodded politely. "I would be happy to share the design," she said softly. Walker gave a small nod of appreciation. "Thank you. We will send official documentation to your school so that the process can move forward properly." After a few more brief questions, the call ended and the screen faded back to the desktop image on the computer. For a moment, the office remained quiet. Principal Brooks turned toward Ava with a smile that carried both amazement and admiration. "You handled that conversation very well," she said. Ava gave a small smile in return. "They asked good questions." Brooks laughed softly. "Yes, they certainly did." Meanwhile, back in the science classroom, Mr. Richard Collins remained standing beside the demonstration table long after the final bell had rung. Most of the students had already left the building, but he stayed behind examining the filtration device one more time. The copper pipes and charcoal chamber looked exactly the same as they had during the first presentation. Yet now the system seemed completely different in his eyes. He remembered the moment when he had laughed at the idea of the project in front of the class. The memory sat heavily in his mind. Collins slowly ran his hand along the wooden base of the prototype. The design was simple but clever. It solved a real problem using materials that could be found almost anywhere. He stepped back from the table and looked around the empty classroom. For many years, he had encouraged students to think creatively about science. Yet somehow he had dismissed the one idea that deserved careful attention. The quiet realization settled in his mind as he turned off the classroom lights and stepped into the hallway. Down the corridor, the office door remained open while Ava and Principal Brooks discussed the next steps in sharing the design with the research team. The small filtration system built in a quiet garage had now reached far beyond the walls of Lincoln Ridge High School, and the teacher who once laughed at the project was beginning to understand that the quiet student he underestimated had just shown the entire school what real scientific curiosity looked like. The following morning, the atmosphere at Lincoln Ridge High School felt noticeably different from any other day in the building's quiet history. News of the conversation with the National Aeronautics and Space Administration had spread quickly through the halls, carried by curious whispers and wide eyes. Students gathered near lockers and along the cafeteria tables, repeating the same sentence again and again. The quiet girl from the science class had spoken with scientists from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Ava Johnson walked through the hallway calmly, as she always did, though she could feel the difference in the way people looked at her now. Instead of laughter or indifference, there was curiosity and respect in their eyes. Some students offered quiet congratulations as she passed. Others simply watched in silence, still trying to understand how a project built in a small garage could reach the attention of engineers working on advanced environmental systems. When Ava entered the science classroom that morning, the copper filtration prototype still rested on the demonstration table where it had remained overnight. The sunlight from the tall windows illuminated the copper tubing and the clear container of purified water like a quiet symbol of the work she had spent months building piece by piece. Mr. Richard Collins stood near the front of the room reviewing the final science fair evaluation sheets. When he saw Ava enter, he paused for a moment before speaking. "Good morning, Ava," he said carefully. The tone in his voice was respectful and thoughtful in a way the class had not heard before. Ava nodded politely and took her seat near the window. The rest of the students slowly filled the room, many of them glancing toward the filtration device with renewed interest. After the bell rang, Mr. Collins stepped forward and addressed the class. "Before we continue today's lesson, I would like to discuss the final science fair results," he said. The room grew quiet immediately. He picked up the evaluation sheet from the judging committee and looked across the class. "The judges have reviewed all of the projects carefully. Several demonstrations showed impressive creativity and effort." His eyes moved briefly toward the demonstration table before continuing. "However, one project clearly demonstrated both innovation and practical application." He turned toward Ava. "The water purification system developed by Ava Johnson has been selected as the top project in this year's science fair." A wave of surprised applause spread across the classroom. Ava remained seated for a moment before standing politely as the class continued clapping. Mr. Collins waited for the room to quiet again. Then he spoke once more, this time with a tone that carried quiet honesty. "Science requires curiosity and patience," he said slowly. "Sometimes it also requires humility from those of us who believe we already understand the answers." The class listened closely. Collins looked directly at Ava. "Ava, when you first presented your project, I did not give it the attention it deserved. For that, I owe you an apology." The room grew still again. Ava met his eyes calmly. "It is all right, sir," she said gently. "The system works. That is what matters." Collins nodded with a faint smile. "Yes, it does." After the brief ceremony, the lesson resumed, though the atmosphere in the classroom remained different from before. Students asked thoughtful questions about filtration efficiency and solar-powered systems, while Ava explained how the device functioned. The laughter that had once greeted her idea had completely disappeared, replaced by genuine interest. Meanwhile, inside the office, Principal Linda Brooks received another message from Dr. Ethan Walker confirming that the research team had begun reviewing the complete design documentation Ava had shared. The engineers believed the concept might influence future approaches to water recycling systems designed for extremely remote missions. Brooks looked out the office window toward the science wing, where Ava's classroom sat quietly beneath the morning sun. The journey that began with a simple experiment in a small garage had now reached beyond the walls of Lincoln Ridge High School and into the hands of researchers studying problems that affected environments far beyond the horizon. And inside the classroom where the project had once been dismissed, the quiet student who built the filtration system continued explaining her work with the same calm focus she had always carried, proving that curiosity and perseverance could travel farther than anyone had imagined. Several weeks passed quietly after the science fair announcement, yet the story of Ava Johnson's filtration system continued to travel far beyond Lincoln Ridge High School. Inside the small garage behind her apartment, Ava still worked at the same wooden table where the original prototype had been built. The copper pipes and charcoal chamber had been carefully cleaned and improved, and a new version of the device now sat beside the first one she had presented in class. The evening air outside carried the cool scent of autumn, while a soft lamp above the workbench illuminated her notebook filled with measurements and diagrams. Ava wrote another line of testing data before closing the notebook gently. The project had never been about recognition. It had always been about solving a problem. Clean water mattered to people everywhere, and she believed the solution should be simple enough for anyone to build. Meanwhile, across the country, inside a research facility connected to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Dr. Ethan Walker and his team continued studying the design files Ava had shared. The engineers had recreated the system using laboratory materials and tested it under different environmental conditions. The results closely matched the data Ava had recorded during her garage experiments. The simplicity of the concept impressed them the most. By using basic recycled components and solar energy, the system could operate in locations where traditional purification equipment required far more power. One afternoon, Walker sent a new message to Principal Linda Brooks at Lincoln Ridge High School. The letter explained that the research team had successfully reproduced the filtration system and confirmed its efficiency. They also invited Ava to participate in a student research mentorship program connected to their environmental systems division. The message arrived at the school office during the final week of the semester. Principal Brooks called Ava into the office and handed her the printed letter with a proud smile. Ava read the invitation slowly, her eyes moving across each sentence, describing the opportunity to work with engineers studying sustainable water systems. For a moment, she remained quiet, absorbing the meaning of the message. Then she looked up and nodded with a small but sincere smile. Back in the science classroom later that day, Mr. Richard Collins watched as Ava carefully packed the filtration prototype into its protective case. The rest of the students had already left for the afternoon, leaving the room quiet except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Collins stepped closer to the demonstration table and looked at the device that had changed the course of the science fair, and perhaps much more. "You built something remarkable," he said quietly. Ava placed the final component inside the case and closed the lid. "I only try to solve the problem," she replied. Collins nodded slowly. The lesson had stayed with him ever since the day the email arrived. Great ideas did not always appear where people expected them. Sometimes they came from the quiet student in the back of the room who simply kept working when others stopped paying attention. Outside the classroom, the evening sunlight stretched across the empty football field as Ava walked toward the front entrance, carrying the case that held her prototype. Students who passed her in the hallway now greeted her with smiles and quiet respect. The girl who had once been ignored had become someone the entire school admired. Yet Ava moved with the same calm confidence she always carried. She stepped outside into the cool evening air and paused briefly at the edge of the sidewalk. Somewhere far beyond the small town where she lived, engineers were continuing to test the idea that began in a quiet garage. And inside a classroom where laughter once filled the room, a teacher now understood a simple truth that would stay with him for the rest of his career. He laughed at the quiet girl science project, but in the end the science spoke louder than anyone's doubts.